Ma'am, step over to the wall. Now I need to ask you some questions.
Am I being detained? Because I paid and you have no reasonable suspicion.
Your attitude is the problem. Hand me your ID before this turns into obstruction.
Then look at this. Department of Justice. Verify it or you're about to arrest the...
The high-definition security camera mounted discreetly above the airport's overpriced coffee stand was about to record a mistake that would cost the city millions and dismantle a police officer's career. The officer in question, Kyle Brennan, had no idea. All he saw was a black woman in a tailored pantsuit paying for a bottle of water and a croissant with a crisp $100 bill. To him, in that moment, that was enough. He was 32 years old, with 7 years on the airport police force, and he operated on what he proudly called a finely tuned gut. That gut, however, was really just a bundle of unexamined biases, and it was screaming at him that something about this woman was wrong. She was too calm, too well-dressed, too confident. The woman was Special Agent Victoria Vance, and she had spent the last 22 years of her life as a federal investigator for the Department of Justice. She had faced down cartel bosses, unraveled complex financial crimes, and stared into the eyes of convicted murderers. The prospect of a confrontation with an overeager airport cop wasn't even a blip on her radar. Victoria had just finished a grueling 3-day assignment and was on her way home. The flight was delayed, and all she wanted was a quick snack before boarding. She handed the cashier the bill, took her change and her receipt, and turned to leave. That's when she heard the voice. "Ma'am, I need you to step over here for a moment." Victoria turned. Officer Brennan was standing there, his posture radiating a kind of rigid authority that young cops often mistake for command presence. He had his hand resting on the butt of his Glock, not as a direct threat, but as a casual reminder of his power. Victoria surveyed him in a half-second glance, a habit from her profession. Young, physically fit jaw tight with manufactured intensity. She saw the whole story. "Is there a problem?" "Officer?" she asked, her voice even and calm. He gestured with his head toward an empty stretch of wall away from the flow of travelers. "I just need to ask you a few questions. Please step over here." Victoria didn't move. Her training had taught her that compliance is a strategic choice, not an automatic response. "I'm on my way to catch a flight. What is this regarding?" Brennan's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to the immediate, slightly fearful obedience of travelers who didn't want any trouble. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. Step over to the wall." Victoria's mind, a finely honed instrument for legal analysis and threat assessment, went to work. This was a seizure under the Fourth Amendment. A person is seized when a reasonable person in their position would not feel free to leave. With a uniformed officer commanding her to move to a specific location, she was effectively being detained. The question was on what grounds? For a temporary detention, a Terry stop an officer needs reasonable, articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot. Victoria had paid for her items. She had not caused a scene, had not been disruptive. She had done nothing. 1,000 other travelers weren't doing at that very moment. "Officer," she said, her voice remaining placid but firm under Terry versus Ohio, "you need reasonable suspicion to detain me. Could you please articulate the specific facts that led you to believe I am engaged in criminal activity?" The legal reference landed with a thud. Brennan's face, which had been a mask of stern control, flickered with confusion and then anger. He saw her question not as a citizen asserting her rights, but as a criminal trying to use fancy words to get away with something. "Ma'am, your attitude is giving me suspicion," he retorted, his voice rising slightly. "Now move to the wall before I make you." This was a classic textbook error. Asserting one's constitutional rights is not in itself a basis for suspicion. Victoria knew this. More importantly, she knew that he should know this. The interaction was escalating and the public setting was becoming a factor. Travelers wheeling their roller bags were beginning to slow down, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. A man sitting at a nearby gate discreetly lifted his phone, its camera lens aimed directly at them. Victoria saw him and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. "My attitude, officer," she repeated calmly. "I am standing here holding a legally purchased snack, and you are detaining me without cause. My attitude is one of confusion. What crime do you suspect me of committing?" Brennan was cornered. He had no crime to name. His gut feeling wasn't probable cause. His suspicion was based on a vague stereotype he couldn't articulate, and her refusal to be intimidated was enraging him. "I have reason to believe you may have used a counterfeit bill?" he blurted out, inventing a justification on the spot. It was a weak one. The cashier had accepted the bill without issue, using a counterfeit detection pen right in front of him. The transaction was complete and recorded on the store's camera. "You can ask the cashier," Victoria said, gesturing to the young man behind the counter who was now watching with wide eyes. He checked the bill. It was valid. Officer Brennan's face flushed a deep, blotchy red. He had committed to a course of action, and his ego would not allow him to back down, especially not in front of a growing audience. He had been publicly challenged by a woman who was supposed to be intimidated, and he was losing control. He felt the weight of the stares from the gathering onlookers. He had to reassert his authority. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he demanded, his voice now hard and clipped. Victoria sighed internally. This was the crossroads. She had given him every opportunity to de-escalate, to walk away. He had refused. Now she would have to end this. "Officer, I will comply under protest," she stated clearly for the benefit of anyone recording. "But let the record show this is an unlawful detention." She deliberately reached into her blazer's inside pocket, moving slowly so he could see she wasn't reaching for a weapon. She bypassed her wallet and her driver's license. She pulled out a small leather credential case. She flipped it open. Inside, behind a protective plastic window, was the unmistakable gold seal of the United States Department of Justice. Her photograph was clear. Her name, Victoria Vance, was printed in bold, and below it, her title, Special Agent. Brennan stared at the credentials, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. For a moment, the entire world seemed to shrink to that small leather case. The sounds of the airport, the rolling luggage, the boarding announcements, the distant chatter faded away. This couldn't be real. "That's a fake," he said, his voice a low growl, but the certainty was gone. He was saying it more to convince himself than her. Victoria held it steady. "It's not. You can run my credentials. There's a number on the back for verification. I suggest you use it." But Brennan was too far down the rabbit hole. Admitting the credentials were real would mean admitting his initial stop was baseless. His escalation was unprofessional, and his judgment was catastrophically flawed. It would be a public humiliation. So he made the worst decision of his entire life. "I've seen fake IDs before, ma'am. Better ones than this," he sneered. "You're being evasive and uncooperative. That tells me everything I need to know. Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Officer Brennan commanded, pulling out his handcuffs. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. The man who had been recording was now standing, his phone held high and steady, capturing every second. Victoria didn't flinch. She had maintained her composure this entire time, and she wouldn't lose it now. She knew that every action, every word was now evidence. Her stoicism was its own form of defiance. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and placed her hands behind her back. She had arrested dozens of people in her career, and she knew the feel of steel cuffs from the other side. As the cold metal ratcheted shut around her wrists, a profound and chilling sense of irony washed over her. She was a federal agent, a sworn officer of the court, being arrested in the middle of a public airport for the crime of buying a croissant while black. "You are under arrest for interfering with a police investigation and attempting to use fraudulent identification." Brennan announced, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear a desperate attempt to justify the unjustifiable. "There was no investigation," Victoria said, her voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "There was only an officer making an assumption based on prejudice. And you are about to make the biggest mistake of your career." Brennan ignored her. He gripped her arm a little tighter than necessary and began to lead her through the terminal toward the police substation. The walk was a modern-day perp walk. Dozens of eyes followed them. Phones were everywhere, a constellation of small glass screens documenting his abuse of power in crystal-clear 4K. Victoria kept her head held high. She made eye contact with several onlookers, her expression unreadable but powerful. She didn't struggle. She didn't argue. Her silence was more damning than any scream. She was already mentally drafting the lawsuit, preserving the chain of custody for the evidence, and planning the calls she would make. Brennan, meanwhile, was marching deeper into a professional grave of his own, digging completely oblivious to the fact that the woman in his custody had the power and knowledge to bring the full weight of the federal government down upon him. The airport police substation was a small, sterile environment smelling of industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. The moment Officer Brennan walked in with Victoria in cuffs, he was met with the bored, experienced gaze of Sergeant Eva Rostova. Rostova was a 25-year veteran of the force, a woman in her late 50s who had seen every kind of foolishness an airport terminal could produce. She looked at the well-dressed black woman in handcuffs, then at Brennan's flushed, triumphant face, and her internal alarm bells began to chime softly. "What do we have here, Brennan?" she asked, her tone flat. Detained her at the coffee stand. Suspicious transaction. Became belligerent and presented a fake federal ID. He reported placing Victoria's credential case on the booking counter with a theatrical flick. Rostova picked it up. The weight and feel of the leather were right. She opened it. She saw the official seal of the Department of Justice, the specific holographic overlay, the microprinting. Her expression didn't change, but a cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She had processed hundreds of arrests. She had seen countless fake IDs, from cheap laminated cards to sophisticated forgeries. This was not one of them. This was real. She looked up from the credentials, her eyes locking onto Victoria's. Then she looked at Brennan, who was puffing his chest out, expecting a pat on the back. "Brennan, what was the suspicious transaction?" Rostova asked, her voice dangerously quiet. She paid with a $100 bill. "Just had a bad feeling about it." Rostova's gaze hardened. A bad feeling. He had arrested a woman based on a bad feeling and was now claiming her authentic federal credentials were fake. Rostova had spent years navigating the department's political landscape and knew a career-ending incident when she saw one. She placed the credential case back on the counter, gently this time. "Take a seat in my office, Brennan," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She then turned to Victoria. "Ma'am, I am Sergeant Rostova. Please have a seat over there. We are going to sort this out." Without another word, Rostova walked straight to the watch commander's office, the credential case held in her hand like a ticking bomb. She knew this wasn't just a bad arrest. This was a full-blown catastrophe. Lieutenant Mark Holloway had been 20 minutes from the end of his shift when Sergeant Rostova walked into his office and closed the door behind her. She didn't say a word. She just placed the open credential case on his desk. Holloway, a man who prided himself on being unflappable, felt his blood run cold. He looked from the ID to Rostova's grim face. "Whose is this?" he asked. "The woman Brennan just arrested in the main terminal for interfering," Rostova said, the quote marks audible in her tone. Holloway stood up so fast his chair rolled back and hit the wall. He walked past Rostova to the booking area and saw Victoria Vance sitting calmly in a plastic chair, her hands still cuffed behind her back. He had seen her picture in department-wide security briefings. He knew exactly who she was. He turned and walked back into his office, closing the door again. He picked up his phone and made a call to the airport's chief of police at his home. The conversation was short, tense, and filled with clipped, urgent phrases. When he hung up, Holloway looked as if he had aged a decade. He strode back out to the booking desk. "Sergeant, uncuff." "Special Agent Vance," immediately he commanded. Rostova already had the key in her hand. Holloway approached Victoria, his face a mask of profound regret. "Agent Vance, on behalf of the Airport Police Department, I want to offer my sincerest, deepest apology for the actions of my officer. You are, of course, free to go. This arrest is being voided." The cuffs came off. Victoria slowly rubbed her wrists, her expression unyielding. She stood up and faced the lieutenant. The victim was gone. The federal investigator was now fully in control. "Lieutenant, I want a copy of everything she stated, her voice like ice. The initial dispatch call, if there was one. All security footage from the terminal. Officer Brennan's body camera footage from the entire incident. I want the booking report you were about to file and a copy of Officer Brennan's written statement of probable cause for this arrest." Holloway nodded, sweating slightly. "Of course, Agent Vance. We will compile that for you." "I don't want it compiled tomorrow," she said, cutting him off. "I want it ready for me before I leave this airport tonight." There was no negotiation in her voice. It was an order. Before Victoria's flight even took off, the video of her arrest was spreading like wildfire across social media. The man who recorded it had sent it to a local news outlet, and from there it went national. The headline was "Irresistible Federal Agent Arrested at Airport After Buying Coffee." By morning, it had millions of views and was the lead story on every major news network. The footage was damning. It showed Victoria's calm demeanor, her clear and lawful questions. It showed Officer Brennan's escalating aggression, his baseless accusations, and the moment he dismissed her valid credentials. Public outrage was swift and furious. The Airport Police Department was buried under an avalanche of angry calls and emails. The Chief of Police issued a public apology and announced that Officer Brennan had been placed on administrative leave pending a full internal affairs investigation. That investigation was the fastest in the department's history. Faced with incontrovertible video evidence, they had little to review. But they also dug into Brennan's history. A clear and disturbing pattern emerged. Over his 7-year career, Officer Brennan had initiated stops and searches of Black and Hispanic travelers at a rate nearly 4 times higher than the department average. Dozens of minor complaints for rudeness and unprofessional conduct previously dismissed as trivial were now viewed in a new, sinister light. He wasn't a cop with a gut feeling. He was a walking, talking embodiment of racial bias with a badge and a gun. The evidence was so overwhelming that the police union, after viewing the footage, informed Brennan they could not defend his actions. 6 weeks after he placed handcuffs on Victoria Vance, Officer Kyle Brennan was terminated for gross misconduct, violation of civil rights, and conduct unbecoming an officer. His career in law enforcement was over, but the consequences of his actions were just beginning. Victoria Vance filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Officer Brennan and the city that employed him. The city's attorneys, after reviewing the case for less than an hour, knew they had no defense. They quickly moved to settle. The final amount was $1.2 million. In a press conference, the only one she would give on the matter, Victoria announced she was donating the entire settlement to a non-profit organization dedicated to police reform and civil rights litigation. This was never about money, she told the reporters. It was about accountability. It was about ensuring that what happened to me does not happen to people who don't have a badge and federal credentials to protect them. Her ordeal, however, triggered something far larger than a lawsuit. The Department of Justice, her own employer, launched a full-scale patterns and practices investigation into the Airport Police Department. The investigation uncovered systemic issues with training supervision and data collection, revealing that Brennan's bias was not an isolated case, but a symptom of a diseased culture. 18 months after Victoria bought her croissant, the city entered into a legally binding consent decree with the federal government. The decree mandated sweeping reforms, mandatory implicit bias, and de-escalation training, the implementation of an early warning system to flag officers with problematic records, a complete overhaul of the citizen complaint process, and years of federal oversight to ensure compliance. A single unjust arrest in a bustling terminal had forced an entire institution to confront its failures. The security camera footage became a mandatory training tool for police academies across the country, a stark lesson in what not to do. Victoria Vance returned to her work as a federal investigator. The incident didn't break her. It fortified her resolve. She knew that what happened to her was an injustice that thousands of ordinary people face every day without cameras, without credentials, without the power to fight back. Her experience, born from a moment of prejudice, had become a catalyst for profound and lasting change. She stood up to a broken system, not just for herself, but for everyone who couldn't. Justice, in this case, wasn't just about the firing of one bad cop or a monetary settlement. It was about forging a better, fairer system from the ashes of a single, deeply flawed encounter. What do you think is the most important lesson other police officers can learn from this story? Do you believe that systemic reforms like the ones enacted here are the best way to ensure accountability? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments below.